Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoyed the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. My guest this week is Doug Rattray. Doug is the managing director of Fugitives Drift Lodge and Guest House in Kwa-Zulu Natal, South Africa. Located very close to Rouke's Drift and Isandlwana, the battlefields from the Anglo-Zulu War. And it's an absolutely spectacular location that I cannot emphasize how valuable it is, how interesting it is, and what a wonderful place it is to visit. So please do take that as a strong recommendation from me if you're ever in that area. Why am I interviewing Doug, though? Doug has an amazing family story. His father, David Rattray, founded Fugitives Drift Lodge along with his wife, Nicky, who's still there running and very actively involved in the facility. And David was tragically shot dead in 2007 in an armed robbery that went wrong. And this is really a story of resilience for the family as a whole. And I was very struck when I visited them in 2023 that they could so easily have been such a different story on the back of what had actually happened to David. Doug was young at the time, and he'll talk about how they handled that experience, how Nicky basically just turned to with the family and looked at what they could do to continue the legacy that David had founded and build on it from there on. And they're doing some amazing stuff today with the lodge itself, with what they do in the wider area, which is a really quite a poor and challenged area of South Africa. And it's just a fantastic story that I think was a great one to start season 3 with and to kick off the new year with in 2025. So I really hope you enjoy it. Off we go. Doug, welcome to the podcast. I am so delighted to have you beaming in all the way from South Africa to talk to me. It's fantastic to have you on, and I'm really looking forward to what I think will be a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, great pleasure. You and your family, you've had a fascinating life. You live in an incredible part of the world, but that's also been tinged with some absolute tragedy. And I think just to get us started, if you could give us a bit of a summary of that journey that you've had so far, that would be great.
So the family story, and particularly associated with Fugitive Drift, starts on the Atlantic crossings of the Second World War with my late grandfather, who had a terrible war. He was a lifelong pacifist, but nevertheless wished to do his duty and put himself in a position, in his own words, that he would never have to kill another human being, but would still run the risk. He had a particularly unpleasant time in Operation Pedestal, the fleet to relieve Malta. He was on the Rochester Castle that managed to limp its way through. And in very many ways, when he came back to South Africa, he found salve for his tortured soul out here on these battlefields. It's a bit of an anathema to think that a battlefield could help a struggling combat veteran, but it certainly did, and certainly has for many people. So my grandfather bought a little postage stamp of land on the banks of the Buffalo River, adjacent to an old farmer by the name of George Bunting, who was the sort of great starter of telling these stories. And my late father, he used to come down here on his school holidays. And in very many ways, he would be dragged kicking and screaming out into the hills of Zululand to go and sit at the feet of the old folk who remembered these battles, and he'd listen to the stories. Being a 10-year-old boy, he was more interested in running and jumping and climbing trees. But yes, it started a love of the wild places, and my father and my mother went into conservation. They started off in the game reserves in the north of South Africa, a place called Mala Mala, a spectacular place, really a cornerstone of South African tourism. And then they went off to Namibia to start a game reserve there, where they were met with tragedy. Their second son was killed in a very unfortunate accident. And it left them not just destitute, but heartbroken. And they came back to South Africa and had the funeral for the small boy at Fugitive Drift, or I should more say the scattering of his ashes. And it was there that evening around the fire that the idea was born that this is where they belong. And so they broke ground in 1989 with the ashes of a son, 50 Rand in the bank account, and hope. That's basically what it was.
Wow. No, I suspect a lot of my listeners will have had at least some idea about the kind of Anglo-Zulu war and where you now are and the battles around Isandlwana and Rouke's Drift. I mean, not least from the films, but they probably haven't got much insight into Fugitives Drift or that further sort of detail around your the hotel you run as well as the game reserve. Can you just expand on that and where you are now? Where have you gone from that establishment point to today?
Of course, it is one of those interesting things, sort of born of conflict, and very late in life that I actually get the early stories from my grandfather. It would cost me a bottle of Glenfiddich every time to fortify the poor old boy. But yes, in 1989, I mean, again, we had almost zero capital to pour into this venture, and I don't think you could start a game reserve or a hotel now without the capital. You sort of put it in one and done. I don't think you could get away with building it organically over time. And we would build as and when we'd saved up enough money to build. This project could not have survived without our friends and our families getting involved. My father's great, or my mother and father's great friends, the Reeds, Mark and Christine Reed of Johannesburg. They own the Everard Reed Gallery. Great supporters of my parents, Robin Woodhead and Andy and May Musa. So many people they'd come down to stay with us. We didn't have any guests. We had sort of 2 rooms, being generous, calling them rooms, donkey boilers, and they would come down and spend a weekend, and they'd pack their vehicles with all sorts of things that a lodge need, which they would just spirit away into the stores and into the kitchen, and then still insist on paying their bill. It was an extraordinary generosity of friendship and time and effort that really got this place going, and I doubt my parents could have done it without their support. And we're eternally grateful for them. They believed in the project. I mean, even Andy and May Musa, Andy, a fascinating story, a South African Indian who became one of the top neonatologists in the United States. The most wonderful people. They were the ones who bought the first giraffe for Fugitive Drift because they thought it would be a nice thing to do. We had people decide that they were going to pay for a room to be built. And so as a result, and I'm sure you remember from your visit, you can see that Fugitive Drift was created organically. There was no central plan. My father did a lot of the plumbing himself, and we're still living with the disastrous consequences of that decision to this day.
I do recall that. Well, you can very much see it has been built up over time, and it's very interesting because I visited South Africa a number of times previously, but I'd never been to Kwa-Zulu Natal, and it's almost like you're in a different country, really. In some ways, it's a very, very much more rural, challenging part of South Africa to kind of build in. I mean, was the original hook for Fugitives Drift built around the battlefield touring idea and all of that, or was it just this seems like a great spot for another game reserve and go from there? How did that evolve?
Well, it was very much centered on the Anglo-Zulu War. My father's mantra, and ours and mine still to this day, is you do not have to have a drop of British or Zulu blood that goes through your veins to find these stories fascinating. They're stories of human beings, of larger than life characters, of extraordinary compassion and great barbarity and conflict. And bear in mind, I've never worn a uniform. I've never seen the face of battle. But these stories of conflict seem to bring out the very best and the very worst in human beings. And it's an intoxicating story. And the game reserve is, ancillary to all of that. It's a sort of nice extra, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
So it was very much built on the whole point was to take people out and move them, to remind them that these are human beings. They were loved.
Well, it's certainly. I mean, I remember when we were with you. I mean, the guide that took us around, particularly around Isandlwana. I mean, I think it was his great grandfather who had actually fought on the battlefield. And absolutely extraordinary to have someone who had really got that lived experience to a degree, which is extraordinary to witness. But just give us a bit of a history lesson into the Anglo-Zulu War and what went on in those two big battlefields, because that would be really useful, I think.
Well, I mean, the danger is how much time have you got?
Enough.
Enough. Well, the story of the Anglo-Zulu War is a story of utter tragedy. It's really a campaign that shouldn't have happened, and without wanting to go into too much of the geopolitical machinations that concocted and conspired to bring this campaign together, in the interests of brevity, I'll just say that Sir Henry Bartle Edward Frere, as governor of Natal, or the High Commissioner, brought about this conflict against the orders of the central British government. The British government had no intention of going to war with the Zulus. Ironically, the British were busy with another campaign at that time in Afghanistan, funnily enough. And so this tragic campaign, this clash between two empires was brought about, and it culminated. Well, it basically kicked off on the 22nd of January. That was when the rounds started flying downrange. The invasion of Zululand happened on the 11th, and swords were crossed on the 22nd. There were three great battles that were fought on that day. The first on the coast, as number one column under the command of Colonel Charles Pearson, was ambushed by a large force of Zulus while on the move, crossing a little river called the Inyazan. The British force there reacted quickly. Midshipman Coker brings the newly invented Gatling gun to use for the first time in British military history. And the Zulu ambush was discovered, and the intended mischief repaid with interest. But of course, a wee further inland in our part of the world, up in the Highlands, Lord Chelmsford, commanding the third column, arguably the most powerful fighting force this part of the world had ever seen up until that point, through various reasons, and it must be said, various good and logical and tragic reasons. People don't know what they don't know, and I think people will often try to fight these historic battles with the gift of hindsight and all the relevant information. But the central column was split following incorrect reports of Zulu activity off to the southeast of the little hill of Isandlwana, and a strong garrison left behind at Isandlwana. And while Lord Chelmsford and his expeditionary force was away, a force of 1,774 British soldiers was wiped off the face of God's earth by 20 to 24,000 Zulu warriors in a battle that raged for no more than 2 hours. It was a complete and utter decimation of a force. People will talk of a rout. There's no evidence to suggest that the professional soldiers of the British Army routed from Isandlwana. It's a tactical withdrawal that failed, and it failed for a number of reasons. And every Zulu ever interviewed would go on and on ad infinitum about the courage and worthiness of their red-coated adversary. And by the end of the day, 55 Europeans had survived that battle, 71 Basotho horsemen, and a handful of what were termed the native levies got out with their lives. And 11 miles away from Isandlwana, that now blood-soaked mountain, at a little mission station that few people had ever heard of called Rouke's Drift, a brave little band of 139 British soldiers, many of whom sick and disabled, would hold out for nigh on 12 hours against 4,500 Zulus in repeated attacks through the night, earning for themselves 11 Victoria Crosses and 4 Distinguished Conduct Medals in one of the most famous last stands in military history. So quite a busy day for all involved, it must be said.
You bring it to life so brilliantly, and thank you, because that is very brief, commendably brief for a very big story. But it is. I mean, having visited both battlefields, I mean, it is very striking. The Rouke's Drift, obviously immortalised in the film Zulu, very well known, obviously here in the UK. And I think that's the story that is most often told. The one that is slightly less often told, other than it sort of hinted at the beginning of Zulu, is that Isandlwana one. And it is very moving when you visit that battlefield and see the cairns that are all still there, which obviously are the funeral cairns from or the burial cairns from those soldiers. And you look at that battlefield and you have that kind of amazing sense of what must it have been like on that particular day, because it is an extraordinary place. And of course, there's a postscript to the story, isn't there? Because you ended up with a couple of those that did manage to flee the battlefield buried on your land, aren't they?
Oh, very much so. Those unfortunate, or I should say, fortunates who managed to escape, and the unfortunates who died on what was now known as the Fugitive Trail. I mean, you can imagine it, this deeply dissected, boulder-strewn, bush-clad terrain. When I say dissected, I mean sort of huge chasms that come out of nowhere in the earthen cliffs. Trying to scramble over that with ammunition boots, steel shod and hobnailed, or if you're lucky, but only slightly luckier, with a horse scrambling over those rocks and boulders. With the Zulus quite easily able to keep up with you. And one officer in particular, Lieutenant Tynemouth Melville, the adjutant of the 1st Battalion of the 24th Foot, scrambling over that terrain with this huge 8-foot tall colour across the pommel of his horse, desperately trying to save the honor of his regiment, gets down to the flooded Buffalo River. I mean, the gods were conspiring against them. They get spat down into this incredibly steep gorge beset by the Zulus, and find that the river is a raging torrent, between 80 and 100 yards wide, 20 feet deep, flowing at 10 knots. And without blinking, he puts his horse to water, decides to cling onto the colour rather than clinging onto the horse, and he ends up washed up against this coffin-shaped rock with a colonial officer and by the name of Higginson. And, of course, on the Natal bank, ready to rock and roll, mounted on his horse, is a delightful Irishman, a young 26-year-old Lieutenant Neville Coghill, an officer of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Foot. And he sees this high drama developing, and without flinching, and it must be said, this is the stuff of which this empire was made, without flinching, the officer with the wounded knee gallops upstream to compensate for the current and puts his horse to water to go to the rescue of his friend with the colour. And almost immediately the horse is shot out from under him, throwing this effectively legless soldier into the river, into the teeth of the current. And again, to cut a very long and tragic story short, they eventually, all three of them, end up on the Natal bank of the Buffalo River, minus the colour, which they lost in one of those aggressive rapids. And Melville picks the wounded Coghill up on his back and carries him for 100 vertical meters out of this impressive gorge, where only a stone's throw from the horses that Higginson had managed to round up, they were overcome by the Zulus and killed side by side at a little spot, a beautiful little spot in a little cleft in the hillside, past which a little stream and waterfall flows in the wet season, where they rest today. It was a tragic story.
And I visited those graves when I was with you, and it is as you say, it's a stunning spot, and it's just, and when you actually stand there, so you tell the story and you bring it to life fantastically, but what of course you don't really see is the actuality of those of the terrain and what they faced, and when you do go and see that, it is quite amazing as well. What was the final story with the color? Because obviously he fought so hard to retain it. What went on with the color?
Well, I mean, you can imagine, as you rightly point out, the physical enormity of what they did to try and save each other, climbing out of that precipice, and add to it, as you well point out, the heartbreak, the complete collapse of their morale, and having lost the color, the sovereign's banner, the physical manifestation of the sovereign on the battlefield. They've lost it in the river. You think of what that must have done to them, But it was after their death, and after the British forces had withdrawn from Zululand and were licking their wounds, preparing for the second invasion, the commanding officer of the 24th was going through the survivors' accounts. CO's name was Glynn, Colonel Richard Thomas Glynn, a man who was described as being easily moved to emotion. And he goes through the survivors' accounts, and he comes across the account of one Walter Higginson that describes the story of Melville and Coghill. And he, on the strength of this, dispatches a patrol back to the Fugitive Drift. And that was 13 days after the fight. They find the bodies of Melville and Coghill and bury them there. Padre George Smith, ammunition smith from Rouke Drift, leading the service. Must have been a most moving event. They then came back 14 days after the fact and built a little defensive position and sent a couple of officers down into the Buffalo River Gorge to scout the gorge in the vain hope of finding the lost color. And one of the officers selected was that delightful 19-year-old lieutenant who you might remember, Charlie Harford, the beloved beetle collector, an eccentric Victorian character. And he was the one who ultimately found the color, spotted 4 inches of color pole breaking the surface of the river, amidst all the heaps of stinking debris that a recent battlefield would spit up, horses and men lying, putrefying in the rocks. And the color was withdrawn. Obviously, the silk embroidery sloughed off from the long immersion in the water, but the banner itself was intact. This triumphant little cavalcade starts to head back towards Rouke's Drift, and it's the most delightful story if you read the diary of this young naturalist. A soldier who was more interested in things that crept and crawled than fighting was old Harford. And he describes how he had the same warmth in his breast that he always got when he had captured a new or rare species of butterfly or climbed up to an almost inaccessible nest and brought the eggs safely down. And he said, I hoped against hope that somehow the signaller on the top of the Oscarberg mountain would have seen with his telescope that we'd retrieved the color. But of course, that was a long shot. And he movingly describes how when they rounded the corner into the mission station, or the now fortress of Rouke's Drift, that the colonel had turned out every single soldier from the cook to the colonel himself to line the road into the post. And they rode between these cheering ranks with helmets being tossed into the air. And he said there at the head of this huge guard of honor was the colonel with his chin tucked into his chest and the tears rolling freely down his face. And he said the colors were handed over to him. And with that, regimental honor was restored.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, such a great story, and thank you very much for telling it so well. Where's the color now? What happened to it after that?
Well, so it's arguably, one doesn't want to upset any of the other military personnel that listen to your podcast when I say this, but they're arguably the most famous Queen's colors in British military history. They were taken into the presence of Queen Victoria after the Anglo-Zulu War campaign. She bestowed upon it 2 great honors. The first, that a wreath of silver immortelles be cast to hang around the crown of that color to replace the wreath of wild flowers that the parents of Durban and Pietermaritzburg had made in memory of their sons who had died at Isandlwana. And the second, that color be allowed to be carried as a 3rd color on parade. It would serve the 1st Battalion, 24th Foot, for a total of 67 years, eventually retired, I believe, in 1933, where it was hung in the Harvard side chapel of the Brecon Cathedral in Brecon, Wales. But that wreath of silver immortelles is still carried by the 1st Battalion Royal Welsh to this day.
Fantastic. Really, really good. Battlefield touring is, for those that haven't done it, is a very interesting, somewhat sobering, particularly when you visit some of the First World War battlefields and things as well. But I have to say the Anglo-Zulu battlefields are just as moving when you go and stand there and look at the sort of scenery and survey the situation and just put yourself in a place of what must it have been like to be there on that particular day. And that is one of the things I think that your guides and you do so incredibly well. So just bring us up to date then in terms of the battlefields. What do you do now at Fugitives Drift? I mean, you said you're sort of centered around the that's still the case, I think, largely, isn't it? So just give us a view of that.
Oh, very, very much so. It's still our primary activity. We're slap bang in between Isandlwana and Rouke's Drift, and we take tours out there every day. So, we'll head out to Isandlwana in the morning and Rouke's Drift in the afternoon and try to not so much educate. I don't like the term lecturer. We're sort of more storyteller. I remember my late father saying that if he comes back from one of these tours and the guests that he's taken with him can recite every name, fact, figure, date, and the color of each horse, but having not felt anything, he has failed. But if they come back not remembering a damn thing, but remember having felt something, then we have succeeded. And I suppose that's our point. These are human beings. They, to us, certainly, they're very much still alive, and should be treated with care. They were husbands and sons, and they were loved and they did love, and their deaths were grieved and their faces remembered, and so we try to keep that memory alive. That being said, our tours can be quite upsetting. Um, you can't really talk about human conflict without things getting quite emotional, which I think is healthy. I think we should actually weep for the dead that died in horrific circumstances. But that being said, on the game reserve side, and in terms of what one can do, we obviously do have a series of walking trails cut through the reserve that we encourage people to make use of. I think we're one of the very few game reserves in South Africa where you can walk around freely without fear of getting squashed or eaten by something, and you don't need a 19-year-old with a high-powered rifle to keep you safe from any big and scaries that might want to rob you of your third dimension. So, we don't have any dangerous game, and people are encouraged to explore the game reserve. Our animals are not tame, but they certainly not fussed about you. And I remember once somebody saying, "Oh, your giraffe seemed quite tame," and I said, "Well, you can in fact touch one of them, but only once and not for very long. They're certainly not tame. Habituated is the word, but they'll stand there and they'll just look at you with utter contempt while you take your photos, and then you'll walk on by." So it's a
brilliant,
beautiful little place. Yeah.
Yeah, it is amazing, and I think your point about coming back having felt something versus remembering all the facts is one very well made. I mean, I think that is, and again, your guides do that brilliantly, because I think they do really do a fantastic job of bringing it to life and giving you a sense of what it was beyond the kind of museum sense of really making you feel that you kind of have got a better understanding of what was there, and that is extraordinary.
Absolutely.
You've touched on this, but you're with your parents originally up in Namibia, losing their second son, but obviously it went further than that, and you're losing your own father. And I without touching too many raw nerves, I mean, if you're happy to talk a little bit about that, I think that's something that takes us into your personal story a little bit, and your family's current personal story about resilience, because you have stuck through with Fugitives Drift despite some really difficult things happening. And I think, this podcast is all about leadership. And I think losing your father in a tragedy and continuing to stay there, doubling down, taking that tragedy and turning it into a triumph is something that I'd like to talk a little bit more about, if you're okay with that.
Absolutely. I don't know if it's madness or some sort of blind hope that drives the family. But we get asked quite a lot about sort of in this sort of vein of questions, and I do quite like to say to people that it's not what happens to you in life that defines you; it's how you deal with it. All human existence will be beset by tragedy eventually, if you're lucky enough to live long enough, or you might actually be the source of that tragedy. But yes, the murder of my father here at Fugitive Drift in 2007 was a dark time, and I remember myself and my three brothers were sitting in the sitting room of what is today my own home, and my mother, recently widowed, looked at us and said, "Right, boys, what do we do? Do we stay or do we go?" And sort of all three of us boys and my mother, we all looked at each other like it was a particularly silly question. Well, we stay. And it must be said, it's not just because it was home. From my mother's point of view, bear in mind we were still schoolboys then, so we didn't have these responsibilities. But from my mother's point of view, it wasn't just home. She didn't just see it as cowardly to turn tail and run, but she couldn't bring herself to abandon all the people that depend on us and on this business. That same attitude of hers was to rear up again in the most recent COVID lockdowns, where she would do a sort of have a similar outlook on life. And I must say it was quite inspiring and quite formative to see this this matriarch of ours, standing strong, defiant and proud, and doing it for others, not for herself. I think it would have been quite easy for her to sell up and run away somewhere and retire and live off the proceeds of the sale. But no, that's not what she's about. And for the sake of her staff and for the sake of her family and for the sake of the families of her staff, she carried on. And then eventually my elder brother joined the fray, and then eventually I joined the family firm. And then my brother now runs a little hotel down in the Western Cape in a place called Plettenberg Bay, beautiful little seaside town. And I'm permanently up at the proverbial farm. But no, there was no option but to carry on. And as a result, we started an educational foundation named after my late father. He was passionate for education. His famous line was, without education, there is no hope, and without hope, there is no future. And between 2007 and today, under his name, we've increased the pass rate in 21 schools, over 6,500 kids. We've increased the pass rate by 42%, and university attendance up by over 30%.
Wow, fantastic!
So it's getting there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. No, thank you for sharing all of that. I think when you say there was no option for your mother, I mean, having met your mother, I mean, I completely see that very resilient spirit. I mean, interestingly, I lost my father when I was 3, and my mum was, I guess, similar-minded, different circumstances, but her whole life fiercely independent, very, very clear that she was going to make sure I had a decent start in life and all the rest of it. And wasn't bowed by it at all. And it is astonishing when you see that resilience in people. Yours must have been all the tougher with obviously with your father having been killed in such a violent way on the effectively protecting your property, as I understand it. And in many instances, you could easily see her option would have been to turn around and go, "I'm not staying here because it's going to be that's happened once, it can happen again," and obviously so on and so forth. So incredible credit to her that she's done that. And even more so, as you say, with the David Rattray Foundation and what you've done with that to be such an important part of what is very clearly a quite challenging area of South Africa in terms of the poverty spectrum and so on there, where you are doing a vitally important job. I mean, that's very evident when you visit there that, you see just how impactful that work would actually be that you're doing. So, huge credit to you.
No, thank you. It's there's always the temptation when these sorts of things happen to fall into the trappings of anger, but that's just exhausting and unproductive and doesn't get you anywhere. And I think you're quite right. There's that resilience that I don't know if it's just me or if it's just in vogue to say, but it seems that resilience is becoming rarer and rarer and rarer. And, there's bigger things to worry about than many of the things that we do worry about as people today. Where is the next meal going to come from? But not just for yourself, but also for your neighbors. How are we going to look after each other and support each other? Which I think are vital questions that don't get asked very often. But anyway, such is life.
Yeah, no, or answered. I think you're right. No, I think this definitely is a leadership trait, if you like, that is a very important one that is all too often ignored a little bit these days, for sure. And that's a nice segue, actually, into looking at you personally and your own kind of leadership journey and what you do within Fugitives Drift. I mean, I'd be really interested in how you have kind of grown into that role, adapted your leadership style over time, consciously, unconsciously, and what values and leadership tenets you think are really important.
Well, that's quite a tough question. It's one of those interesting things. I think my outlook on the entire subject of leadership was shaped largely, obviously, by my parents, and secondly by these sort of examples of people in the history around us here. With respect to my parents on the sort of practical side of things, when we'd come back from school, if we showed an interest, we could earn a bit of pocket money by working for the lodge, and it was used as a training opportunity by my parents. You started from the bottom. There was that old I don't know if it still happens anymore in the hospitality sector, but no matter what, or in South Africa, that is, no matter what your position is, you will go and work every single job there is to do on the property so that you know exactly how long it takes, exactly what you need in terms of time, tools, and equipment, and that you actually have an appreciation for what the people who work under you do. And so that you're not just a taskmaster, you can actually do it. And I remember my mother explaining to me after a particularly tough day of building roads, which we do this time of year every year, thanks to the big thunderstorms that come over. This was before the advent of hydraulically powered digging equipment. And, well, I suppose a human being is hydraulically powered, aren't we? Anyway, but swinging a pickaxe mining shale. And as a 16-year-old boy, my hands were in pieces. And I went to complain to my mother saying that isn't there something easier I could be doing? And she said, understand one thing and understand it well. I said, if you want to work here one day, you must never, ever, ever be in a position where you ask a member of staff to do a job that you have not done yourself or are not prepared to do yourself.
That's a great point. Great point.
There's, whether it's climbing into septic tanks or dealing with snakes or going out with the anti-poaching unit or getting under a vehicle, we're a very, very close-knit firm here. We all doing it together, from building roads to cutting firewood to telling the stories. It's we try to do everything, which perhaps is not the best tactic in the world, but it does make life quite exciting when people say, what are you going to be doing tomorrow? You say, well, I have a few things I'd like to achieve by tomorrow, but that might be very different. You might end up firefighting or digging trenches or whatever 1,000 other things it could be. With regards to the sort of inspiration and who I'd like to model myself on, and I'd like to think I'm sort of there, but by God, we can all do it better, can't we? Is a little bit of John Chard style of leadership. John Chard, as you well know, was the commanding officer of the Rouke Drift mission station. And when he was informed of this disaster at Isandlwana, in the absolute, it must have been a panic. I mean, yes, we like to say, stiff upper lip, don't panic, keep calm and carry on. But there must have been, when the penny dropped of what had happened across the Buffalo River and what was now coming for them, there must have been an increase in the heart rate. And in this moment, a subordinate from the commissariat department, James Langley Dalton, comes out with a suggestion for the fortification of Rouke Drift. And not only does John Chard and Gonville Bromhead leap on this idea, but they relegate themselves to laborers under his supervision, carting the bags themselves. And when the dust settled and the plan was proven after the conflict, both Chard and Bromhead would give credit to the subordinate who'd come up with the idea and plan of the fortification. And so I would always argue that displays leadership of a great magnitude in a time of crisis, to recognize when a subordinate has a good idea, trust them to action that plan, give them every credit when the plan is proven, which I don't think happens enough. I think far too often subordinates get their ideas stolen from them and credit stolen from them, which doesn't build anyone up, just breaks them down.
Fantastic points. So many of the things you've just said there resonate so strongly with me and the work I actually do today in terms of leadership development of people, where my basic thesis with a lot of the work I do is that a lot of corporates who I tend to work with do not do leadership development well, because they just don't do it really a lot of the time. They just do it by osmosis.
Yes, yeah.
So, people pick up leadership skills along the way because they see things they like and hopefully they discard things they don't like, but they don't really get any kind of proper equipment of the right kind of tools and ideas and things to think about. And those points you bring out about leading by example and basically getting your hands dirty essentially and doing the stuff that you're expecting other people to do, I 100% agree with that. And I think it's such an important thing. And equally that, the whole empowerment element and taking ideas from people who've got good ideas, but most importantly, as you just said, giving them credit for doing that, not sort of stealing Absolutely. The credit, saying thank you is, I think thank you are two of the words that are probably the most underutilized in the English language when you put them together in the same sentence in a work environment.
I couldn't agree with you more. It is absolutely extraordinary what human beings will do. I hate to use the term, but for a pat on the head. We are so desperate for validation and to do a good job as people. It's that whole thing of getting a good review, a good feedback makes the soul soar. And I don't think we do that very often as people. Even if it's a mundane, small thing. Thank you very much. That was beautifully done. To receive that just makes you smile.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, and again, I totally agree. We just don't do it enough. I mean, and we totally underestimate the value of it a lot of the time. If from anybody in any leadership position, particularly a senior one, going and spending a bit of time just sat by somebody's desk or writing them a little letter or ringing them up just to say thank you and acknowledge what they've done is invaluable.
But it's also, I mean, if I can take it a step further, the like with all these stories, it's all well and good to go and muck in and mine shale and swing a pickaxe and all of that sort of wonderful stuff. I have a particular hatred of computers and emails, so I'll quite often get myself out of the office by going and doing some manual labor because it's quite fun. But it's just also never tell people how to do their job without good reason. The overbearing, standing there watching, offer gentle encouragement and maybe suggest a better way of doing things. But for the love of God, don't go up to somebody who's been doing a particular job for so long and think you know how to do it better. It's the most infuriating thing when you go to other game reserves and you'll see the road building team out there and some intern will arrive and say, oh no, we can do it better. This is how, and you just watch the whole thing fall apart. Yeah. Anyway, I have some controversial thoughts on the matter there, but
no, I totally agree with you. In the military, we used to talk a lot about mission command was the term that we had, which was essentially tell someone what you want done, not how to do it.
Exactly.
And you give them the box to work within. That was this is the box you're empowered to work within, and depending on how much you trust them and how much experience they've got and what their skill set is and all that sort of thing, that can be a very big box or a very small box. But don't tell them how to do it. Just turn around and let them get on with it and see what they come up with a lot of the time. And particularly with people who've been doing it a long time, you'll probably find they're coming up with ideas that you wouldn't have had, and they're doing it a lot better than you would have done it.
Oh, completely. And, my stepfather, Miko, he's a fascinating character. He grew up in the Catholic orphanages of Australia and made a huge success of himself as a consultant for the mines and for various government departments in Australia. But aside from that, we'll be out there in the bush and building things or burning fire breaks or fighting fires. And this Toyota Land Cruiser will start creeping up on us, and out would pop this delightful Australian with a hot box of tea and coffee and biscuits, and call all the team together, down tools, right? Everybody, let's have a perch under the shade of a big fig tree, and let's have a cup of tea or coffee. Just little things like that, small little gestures of let's just take a breath and then crack on. And for God's sake, sit together. Don't put people over there and people over there. Everyone sit together under the tree. It goes a long way. Just treat people like human beings.
No, totally so. Great points. I always try and look at sort of highs and lows, Doug, about people's careers. And when you look back across your careers so far, is there anything you'd wish you'd done differently? First question.
In terms of my sort of professional role, I haven't really done it for long enough. I'm effectively 10 years in this profession. Perhaps it would have been nicer to have been a wildlife guide for a wee while longer, but I certainly don't regret coming from the proper bush back here. I don't know if there's anything I would have or could have done any differently. Obviously, there are a few sort of individual things where you think, oh, I could have handled this this sort of HR issue a bit better, or this one a bit better. Certainly in terms of acquisitions, you think, well, could have saved a few pennies here and a few pennies there. But other than that, my mother is still very much the matriarch here. She is, I don't quite know how to describe her. She's a force of nature.
It's a good description.
Well, she's quiet and calm, and much like an elephant. quiet and calm and all-seeing and all-knowing, and very, very, very rarely loses her temper at all. The most she's going to give you is the sort of Queen Victoria-esque, "we are not amused." And when you get that tight voice of, "What do you think you're doing?" you know you have erred quite substantially, and she is most displeased with you. But
Lovely.
she's, we're all in fear of disappointing her, not angering her, which I think is the right way to do it. And she's always there with a gentle guiding hand and stopping me from making a catastrophic mistake, be it, professionally, or dealing with a staffing issue or a maintenance issue or a service provider. And so she's always there with a gentle touch on the reins. And certainly going to miss her when she eventually decides she's going to retire, if that is in fact allowed. And so I wish I could give you more of an answer.
No. That's a good answer. I think I often talk in different contexts about forks in the road and things like that, where you have different choices you make. And I'm very much one of these people that, I'll go down a particular fork and I don't tend to think about having got a mile down the road that I wish I'd taken the other fork. And I mean, interesting, a friend of mine who very kindly also did a podcast for me a while ago, he had a great expression where he said, it's okay to look back, but just don't stare. And I think that was actually a really good description, because that's so true that, I think if you spend your whole life looking backwards, all you do is fill yourself with what if, whereas actually you've done that, you've made that choice, just get on with it.
You start fantasizing about the ghost of something that never existed.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What's your high point then so far? Notwithstanding your, as you said, you've still got a long way to go.
Well, the high point, I think my high point was, are we allowed to be somewhat self-aggrandizing here?
Absolutely.
It doesn't come naturally. I'm starting to go red just thinking of it. I think my high point was when I was asked to present the story, condensed story, an hour long, at the Chalk Valley History Festival, and sort of standing on that stage and seeing a tent of 700 and some change people, people sneaking in and cramming in and standing at the back. And that hour passed by in the blink of an eye, and receiving my first ever standing ovation from just shy of 1,000 people for, an hour of talking in a tent in that beautiful countryside of Chalk Valley. I think that for me is right up there. Every year, seeing the Royal Welsh join the Zulu royal family at Isandlwana in commemoration is also one of my great achievements, although I was but a small cog in that wheel. I'd say those two right up there with what I'm most proud of.
So I'm not surprised by that. No, it's a great memory. It must have been really impressive. And you're such a great storyteller. I can completely imagine why you would have got that standing ovation from the crowd on that day. That's for sure.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
Well, sadly, for every high point, there's a low point. What's your kind of career low point?
The career low point, I would have to say it was during the COVID pandemic. Professionally, emotionally, psychologically, that was devastating for us out here. Set us back probably about 3 or 4 years, as opposed to just the 2 or 3 that it materially did. Again, we spoke about that, my mother refusing to abandon the staff when our accountant, quite an astute chap, and saw the lockdowns coming a mile away, came up and said, "We need to start talking about redundancies." And my mother looked him dead in the eye and said, "Over my dead body." And he looked at her and said, "Right, we're now a fixed cost business." And we got through the COVID lockdown years without laying off any of our staff, which sort of decimated the family finances, but I think absolutely worth it. And sitting by and just watching your industry degrade, and quite frankly, and I must admit, being somewhat sort of angry about it, not just me, but I believed from the rhetoric that was going around that I would not see many of our staff members again, that they were going to die. people that had carried me as a child, that had been there my entire life, that I wasn't going to see them again. And I still get quite choked up thinking
Did you
about
lose
that
any dad?
awful Monday. Two.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, I think full respect to your mother for that decision around protecting the
Yeah.
people over and above the business, because I think the long-term gain, I hope for you in that is obviously the loyalty that it inspires from the people you've got working there, who I'm sure won't forget that, because they will clearly realize that the outcome could have been very different, and that loyalty is definitely a two-way street. I mean, it's people do come back and respect that.
Well, a business is only as good as its people.
Yeah, no, definitely so. And again, I think that's something that's all too easily forgotten by lots of people. When it's easy to turn around and make quick, short-term decisions that you then regret longer term. And I've seen, certainly in this country, we've seen lots of that over the years. And I think it's a real challenge. I mean, I was going to come back to the pandemic anyway, because I know just from when I visited you, and we were talking about this because it was obviously not long after that, really, that you were hit very hard by it. You've mentioned the Royal Welsh coming back. You obviously still have quite a kind of military model in terms of people coming out to visit you. What's the business look like now? I mean, how are you reshaping things on the back of that? What's changed as a result of it? Are there positives as well as negatives?
Well, the recovery of South Africa, if we could sort of zoom out and then zoom in. So South Africa's tourist numbers are doing very well, particularly for the Western Cape and the Kruger National Park area. Kwa-Zulu Natal has been quite slow to recover, even now. There are many reasons for that. Chiefly, South Africa didn't have a very pleasant time in terms of extreme weather events. Durban got flooded out twice, and bridges got quite literally moved a couple of inches downstream by the force of some of these floodwaters. So we had a bit of a difficult time, and so the tourist numbers haven't quite recovered in KZN. The provincial government has embarked on this grand crusade since our most recent elections of making KwaZulu-Natal. Their aim is to make it the safest province in South Africa, and to be fair to them, they've made some great gains in doing so. And so things are slowly but surely recovering in KZN, even in this late year of 2024. In terms of our guest makeup, the people always said to us, aren't you afraid that your guests are going to die out? As though, all the old fuddy-duddies who are interested in history are not long for this world. And we always sort of said to them, well, hang on a second, typically as people get older, they get more interested in history. And there is this huge boon at the moment in the youth, in particular, consuming historical content on social media, through podcasts and YouTube and the like. And so the average age of our guests is actually getting less and less. The majority of our guests are still British, not necessarily of a military background, but largely quite sympathetic to military history. And so we are getting more and more people. We're also getting more and more continental Europeans who don't quite come for the history, but more come for the walking. And they'll use us as a nice little walking stopover between here and the wherever they're going to. So things are sort of changing a little bit. In terms of the Royal Welsh, that visit is starting to get bigger and bigger and bigger every year. They are planning on sending 150 soldiers out with the band and the colour party for the 150th anniversary. This coming commemoration, there's 35 of them coming out. And every year it's being greeted with more and more and more excitement, not only from the local provincial government, but also from the Zulu side of things. The Zulu royal family getting more and more sort of excited and keen that the representatives of the British Army are making the effort to come and visit them every year, which I think is absolutely spectacular. So we can look forward certainly to the Royal Welsh coming out, obviously operational requirements dictating every year henceforth.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That is really, really good news. And I'm very pleased that you're starting to see a slightly different demographic and things as well, because I think that, as you say, you have to evolve.
Oh, completely.
And that is and that's terrific that's going there. Zooming back out again then to South Africa more generally. As I mentioned earlier, I've been there 3 times. I love it. My father was born there, and I'll certainly be coming back because I think it's just the most incredible country. And I've got that kind of I guess, genetic link to bring me back anyway. But it obviously is a country that, when you look at it from an external dynamic, particularly has huge challenges, not least politically, corruption, etc., having been very much a feature of the kind of political discourse. And just with those latest elections earlier this year, the ANC obviously lost its majority for the first time in the 30 years it's been in power. I'm just interested in your reflections on how you see the political and economic future, how it's changing, what your sense is of the prospects.
Well, I mean, God, big question. But so I'll give you a sort of anecdote from the proverbial social media youth. It wasn't too long ago that a little video went absolutely viral in South Africa of I believe a chap in Cape Town who made a video sort of staring into the camera like a suspicious meerkat looking for a predator. And he said, guys, does anybody else get the feeling that South Africa is running suspiciously well? And it sort of resonated with how a lot of South Africans are feeling. You know, as a result of these elections, you know, we haven't had any power outages. The huge state projects on the roads, building up our highways, are suddenly kicking into high gear and noticeably working. And when I say noticeably working, I don't mean over months. I mean, you sort of go there day by day and you see the progress. You're starting to get much more communication from local governments about water and electricity. I mean, people are now getting their issued passports in 2 weeks, which is most inconvenient because we normally plan for a couple of months. And so there's a sense of I think euphoria. You know, obviously that dies down as we move away from the elections, and you know the same issues that we've been having start to take center stage again. But I mean, in terms of sort of criminality, the government have taken a zero tolerance approach. I mean, God help you if you're a criminal now, because I think he's the only one that would. And there just seems to be a feeling, a sort of relaxed, cautiously optimistic feeling that we're now on the right track, and we're now ready to rise, you know, like the proverbial phoenix from the ashes. And just as we start getting our act together, the rest of the world seems to, you know, fall off the rails a little bit, which is given our luck, you know, par for the course. But yes, there's a strange feeling at the moment. You know, everybody's sort of smiling and grinning from ear to ear, and I know certainly I am. You know that the human potential of this country is within an ace of being unlocked.
That's awesome to hear, because it is it's been one of those stories where I work actually with quite a lot of South Africans, either who still live in the country or who used to live there but now don't.
Yeah.
In the work I currently do, not least with Deloitte University and things, where the African Deloitte firm supports that quite a lot. Again, it's a very mixed story. You know, some people are, you know, I think everyone acknowledges it's a wonderful country, but you know, lots of people, particularly the white South Africans, to be fair, have often moved out and said, "Oh no, I've decided it's not for me anymore." And I'm really encouraged to hear that, because I think it is an amazing place, and I mean, it's from a tourism point of view. Speaking specifically as a Brit, going to South Africa at the moment, of course, is an incredibly good thing to do from a financial point of view, because the rand pound exchange rate means it's it's a very, very good value.
You get a lot of holiday for your pound.
You certainly do. Yeah, I mean, that was extraordinary.
Those young professionals that you work with, you know, I do think this country owes them an apology, by and large. But you know, as a total number, there are now more black university graduates leaving South Africa than white. Not as a percentage of demographic, or as percentage of population, but as a total number. And you know, we owe those young people a deep apology. If we have, when I say we, if the government has created a position where they can't put their university degrees to work in their own country and they're forced to go overseas in pursuit of a better life, then we have failed them. And I personally long for the day when we can make it attractive for them, as attractive as it was to leave, for them to come back.
Yeah, and based on what you're saying, I'm sure that'll happen. I mean, interestingly, I think it's it is interesting when I look at totally different place and a totally different set of conditions. But when I was in Afghanistan, one of the things that was very evident there was that a lot of local Afghans were, the moment they felt in a position to leave, they were leaving because they saw their personal prospects as nowhere in the country. Whereas in reality, of course, what was needed was for them to stay to develop their own country, because they were the people that were absolutely crucial to be able to take that forward. And I think that's just as true in South Africa. And clearly the conditions in South Africa are completely different. And therefore I would hope it'd be much easier for them to do that.
Slightly better, I think.
Yeah. just a bit. Yeah. And it's slightly more advanced in terms of of all aspects, really. But no, it's really encouraging, because I think the popular perception, you mentioned power outages. I mean, there are lots and lots of people who still talk about that external to South Africa as one of the things that's known is, you have this load shedding and you're constantly without power and so on. So that's great if that's changing.
It is a little bit frustrating because towards the end of last year, we eventually retired the old generators and replaced them with new, much more efficient ones. And then, this year, load shedding stops, which was most irritating. Very grateful that we don't have to use the new generators, but could have come 6 weeks prior. So yeah, we haven't had load shedding for God knows how long now.
That's really good. That is very good news. On a slightly different, but I guess sort of semi-related topic, I mean, climate change is something that certainly in the UK, but I think all over the place now, is a growing topic of public discourse. You're obviously in a place that has a lot of focus on conservation. You have a clearly likelihood of being quite significantly impacted by it in terms of your geographical location on the planet. I'm just wondering how it feels to you in terms of what's happening, what you're already seeing.
Well, I mean, I'm quite a passionate conservationist, as I'm sure you well remember. My degree is in nature conservation, and I would never propose to lecture people on what they should or shouldn't do. But just from our own standpoint, one of the biggest threats facing South Africa and facing us as a game reserve is what's called bush encroachment, and it's we're losing our grasslands to the indigenous woody plant species that are taking over. Now, this is for a number of reasons. Primarily, we need frost to kill the saplings. We need proper fires to beat back the thickets. And we're not getting those frosts anymore. And the grasses aren't building up. It's as a result of poor land use and land management over the subsequent years and changing climate. More CO2 in the atmosphere equals more trees. And we're losing our grasslands. And this property is being swallowed up by trees. Now, yes, they may be indigenous, but nevertheless invasive. And so we're constantly dealing with trying to fight back and undo this damage that's being done to our grasslands on a national scale. And unfortunately, we are going to lose that fight. All we're doing is hanging on. So, it's a very real thing. And the consequences in terms of the loss of biodiversity for us as our grasslands get consumed, which obviously that's the macrofauna and the microfauna, the small things and the big. Eventually, we're just going to have things that browse and not very many of them. That's more a problem, I think, for my great-grandchildren to inherit than myself or my immediate children. But a problem nonetheless. And a bit of forward planning and forward thinking, I think, is necessary to try and arrest all of this.
Yeah, interesting. That's an aspect I hadn't heard of as specifically put as that. That's really, really useful insight.
But you can see it. It's 1% of our grasslands is under conservation, and bush encroachment is becoming such a serious issue in South Africa that even game reserves are now having, with elephant, bear in mind, are now having to try and experiment with herbicides deployed from drones to beat the bush back. And so it's things are changing. Would I be able to tell you why they're changing? Absolutely not. But I can certainly tell you I have an idea. And yeah, it's a very real, very visible, very obvious thing to see. You don't just need to look at glaciers retreating. You can look at grasslands retreating and forests advancing.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting indeed. Getting towards the end, Doug, and I guess you've said some of this already, but I just think it's worth reiterating, really. I mean, I visited Fugitive Drift. I came there in 2023. I think it's stunning. I mentioned, and you've talked very eloquently about the battlefield tours and the incredible guides you've got. But I mean, I certainly would be an advert for you. I think it's a place that should be on everyone's bucket list. But just give us your sense of what makes Fugitives Drift and the battlefield so special again. So, why should people come to you?
Well, South Africa does I think enjoy a hugely disproportionate profile in the minds of people, because of the triumph of humanity over the apartheid system. That humanity represented in the nobility of Nelson Mandela, and so South Africa does have this sort of romantic spot in people's minds. This beautiful country, the beautiful rose, with its own thorns, and I always say to people, well, you can never really understand a country without understanding its people. And you can never understand its people without understanding their history. And a lot of people have the question as to why is South Africa the way it is? And the answers to those, all the major political forces that are alive and well today were alive and well and during the War of 1879. And so if you want to scratch that itch and understand why this beautiful country is the way it is, you actually need to go out onto these battlefields and sit there and listen and be moved and look at the memorials, the testaments to the folly of humankind. And in that, those questions will be answered. And so I think if you want to try and understand this country, you need to go and walk upon the fields of conflagration. And of course, that's exactly what we do.
Beautifully put. Thank you very much. There's two questions I always ask on these podcasts. The first of which this one might be different to your kind of career high point, is what's the most memorable event of your life so far?
Can I cheat and give you two?
Yes, you can.
So the top one used to be summiting Torongla Pass in Nepal, and the Annapurna circuit, 16 days of trekking. That I thought was, one of the most extraordinary moments of my life. But then that was somewhat eclipsed a few years ago when I did an Atlantic crossing on a 60-foot schooner sailing from Trinidad to Cape Town by way of Brazil. And, so 2.5 months at sea with my world being at between 25 and 30 degrees. Seeing the coast of South Africa, those beautiful mountains, start to emerge off the starboard bow, was for me one of the greatest moments of my life.
Wow, that's a serious trip. I've got a few friends who sail, and I think credit to you for doing that. Well,
it was a big one. We did it the wrong way around and upside down, which added to the difficulty, but of course increased the sense of achievement.
Yeah, no kidding. And the very last question that I always ask is, what's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
It's there are so many, and it also determines, what does one mean by difficult? Difficult to keep a straight face. Well, I once got asked how many birds does a giraffe hunt a day, but in the sort of slightly more personal one, I got asked once. It was a school exercise, and the question was, what would you want written on your headstone?
Wow.
What would you want to be remembered for? And I still don't have an answer to that. What would I wish to be remembered for? If you think of Captain Lawrence Oates, remembered as a gallant gentleman, I'm going for a walk, I may be some time, sacrificing himself to save the others, albeit in vain. Would you want, here lies a good and honest man, here lies a kind human being? It's a tough one. What would you like to be written on your headstone? How would you like to be remembered?
And that was asked by a school party, was it?
Yes, yeah, it was an essay at school, and I forget who the English teacher was. I think it was Mr. Tarr, who always used to wear a Harris tweed jacket and smoke a pipe in the cloisters before class. A marvelously eccentric character. What would you like written on your headstone? Which to ask a 15, 16-year-old boy is quite quite a heavy subject.
Yeah, that's an interesting question to ask you as a boy. Blimey, that's very unusual.
Well, the school motto was always very interesting. The school motto officially was, Kwa-Zulu Natal, who is like God. But the last doorway that you walk out of when you matriculate was quit ye like men. And the founder, James Cameron Todd, said, our aim is not to make accountants and lawyers and barristers and bureaucrats, but it is to create men of compassion and men of understanding. And they hammered that into us. And what would you like written on your headstone? It's something that still gives me pause to this day.
Well, I have to say, based on the creating men of compassion and men of understanding, I think knowing you a little bit, I think they succeeded.
Oh, well, that's most kind of you.
Not at all. It's been absolutely fantastic. I've loved the conversation. I could have talked to you for a lot longer, but I wish you every success for the future at Fugitives Drift. I think I would absolutely recommend to anybody that's listening to this that if you're heading anywhere near South Africa, you certainly should be putting it on the list to go and visit. It is an extraordinary place, and I'm very, very grateful to you, Doug.
Well, that's very kind of you, Bob. Thank you so much for your time.
Not at all. Absolute pleasure. If you've enjoyed this interview with Doug Rattray, and I really hope you have, then please give me a little help. Share it widely on social media, make your friends aware, make your network aware of this episode, but also the podcast more widely, and just help me to get more listeners, broaden the podcast. That helps me continue it because it'll make a big difference in terms of the long-term viability of the show. If you fancy going a little bit further than that and helping me out financially, that would be enormously beneficial to me, and I would be incredibly grateful to you. And you can do that in a couple of ways. You can go to support the show. The link in the podcast platform that you're listening to this on will take you there. And that'll take you to patreon.com/leading for life. You can go there directly as well using that web link. And you can join as either a supporter, a champion, or a patron of the show and make a small financial contribution that will make a very big difference to what I am able to do. And I would be particularly grateful. But either way, I'm just grateful for you listening. Thank you very much indeed. And more to come soon. But thanks a lot. Bye for now.